little bit short on here. Okay, so we've got that going. Okay, alright. So, let's start. Good koto, and nice to see you in the flesh. I didn't actually realise there were this many of you up here. I thought there was just like a wee group and that's all you lot. So, yeah, nice to be here. So I thought what we'd do is, you know, sort of like you usually see on the recording, except that because we're sort of getting to the business end of it, I thought if we could sort of make sure we get through a bit and maybe do like 25-30 minutes and then a wee break and another 25-30 minutes. So that means that the last lecture, which is on Wednesday, I can kind of get to the end, right?
Yep.
Following the usual thing of addressing essay questions, this is a question I got from somebody yesterday. She said, are we allowed to say, for example, the curriculum should have been inclusive of da-da-da, but rather was focused around da-da-da, or is that too sort of opinion-based? And it's an interesting question because the short answer is kind of avoid that because the essay isn't really asking you, you know, so like I mentioned previously, it isn't asking you to find a solution. It isn't saying this should happen, that shouldn't happen. It's kind of analysing what is and why it is and that kind of stuff. So look more for that kind of explanation and analysis rather than saying that this is what should be happening. You know, if this was happening, it would be good. So you're not actually trying to find a solution to this thing. You're trying to show that you understand the complexities of it. Okay, so it's not saying don't ever say that, but it's a good question because if you find yourself saying that, think it again and try and change tack a bit. Okay, so just to sort of recap on where we were. Well, those clickers, fantastic. These people with clickers, I didn't realise how fun they were. So we looked at the 1980s and this sort of period I said is mainstream recognition, went over kaupapa Māori education philosophy. And so what I want to do now is complete our look at the 80s and also look at the 90s and this decade of treaty settlements. So what we got in the 1980s, again with these headings, there's the Springbok tour protests. Actually, no, I've done the Springbok, yeah. So this is the 1980s stuff, right? So we looked at Springbok tour, we looked at Kohanga. What I want to look at now is the Hikoi to Waitangi in 1984, because that was pretty huge. 1984. There's a big George Orwell book, 1984. 1984 in New Zealand was politically a big deal. The National Party had been in power since 1975. So they won in 1975, and then they won in 1978. And then in 1981 there was the whole Springbok tour stuff. But Muldoon, who was the Prime Minister through all this, knew that however chaotic and terrible it was and however badly New Zealand ended up looking on the international scene and however much we supported apartheid, the people who supported the National Party, like the rural people in provincial areas that couldn't see past their rugby, were going to vote for them again. And so they got back in, but they actually got in with less votes overall than Labour got. So, but it was the old first past the post system, so they still won. So they got 3 more years when the country, especially people in cities, were just had an absolute guts for. So by the time 1984 came, and Muldoon had kind of lost the plot in so many ways, you've probably seen that footage of him calling the snap election when he looked like he'd had a few too many whiskies, and then they were bowled by Labour. So Labour came in. But the beginning of it. But just to get back to the point of this. The snap election was called in July and was held in September. The beginning of that year, of the last year of the Muldoon government, was the Waitangi protests were absolutely massive. There was this, it had been building up year upon year upon year, nothing had been happening. And by 1984 there was this massive hikoi, and it basically got to the point where it couldn't be ignored anymore. It had to be taken seriously. They could no longer be just kind of dismissing Māori claims as just a few radicals when you had all of these kind of previously sort of respectable conservative Māori elders from all over the place engaged in this massive protest. So it really kind of put things on the map, and it was a kind of transition thing from the 70s, where this was kind of seen as a bit radical and out there, to being kind of absolutely unavoidable. So later that year, Labour won the election, and you had, you know, sort of grizzled old Muldoon, and then fresh-faced David Lange, who was like, you know, 20 years younger, and, you know, this whole new kind of generation of political leaders. And the slogan that Labour used to win that election in 1984 was bringing New Zealand together again. So it was away from the divisiveness, and I mean, it's all sort of political slogans and so on, but it was a pretty horrible time up until then. So Labour got back in, and there was a sort of exciting new prospects of what could happen. And what they did is they organised these summits. So part of bringing New Zealand together again was that they would gather all these people up. So the first big one was the Economic Summit, and they had like the head of the Business Roundtable and the spokesperson for the Unemployed Workers Union, you know, from the captains of industry to the poorest people, getting together and trying to figure out together what would be the solution. They had a women's summit, and they had all these summits, right, where everybody was going to come together and we're all going to live happily ever after. And one of these was a Māori Development Summit, Hui Taumata. And that was actually a pretty significant one, because some quite kind of clear directions and demands came from that, and that was sort of formally recognising the stuff that sort of couldn't be avoided from the hikoi. So, so what happened is that in the wake of all of that, one of the critical things was that the Labour government gave greater scope and powers and resourcing to the Waitangi Tribunal. You recall from last time, the Waitangi Tribunal was actually set up by National in 1975, but all it could do was look at current claims and current grievances. It couldn't look back. So what Labour did is that it backdated. It gave the power of the Waitangi Tribunal to go to look back, right back to 1840, to the signing of the treaty. It still only had the power to recommend, but it had considerable persuasive force. I mean, it was the people on the Waitangi Tribunal were you know, respectable, learned academics and people from the community, chosen by government but charged with that responsibility to sort of thoroughly look at these claims and try to address them in a fair way. And so when this change happened, Māori increasingly came to look at this, and everybody did really, as a formal mechanism for properly investigating and hopefully properly addressing all the historical grievances of Māori, so we can sort it all out and move forward. Now, the thing about this is that when this policy was implemented, it was still implemented at this time when most people, including I think the Labour Party leaders who decided this, still basically believed this idea that the whole history of colonisation in New Zealand was pretty benign, you know, that nothing really terrible had happened. And so basically what we'd be doing is we'd be tidying up a few loose ends and sorting things out so we could just sort of, you know, get all on the same page and move forward together. Because people didn't realise how serious a lot of that history was. What happened was, though, that the whole kind of floodgates opened in terms of these claims, and pretty much every Māori hapu in the country had some claim that they had been concerned about, and some of them they tried to advance them before and got nowhere. Most of them hadn't even bothered because they had basically got the message that we're not interested. So, you know, there's no point, there was nowhere to go, basically. There was no, because of all that kind of legal history, there was nowhere for claimants to go previously to raise these things where they'd get a proper hearing. So now there finally was. And so these Māori groups all around the country researched and documented all manner of breaches that were you know, finally kind of documented and brought to the Waitangi Tribunal. And interestingly, you know, this was probably the one time in the New Zealand history when a historian was like a really valuable person, because, you know, the skills of a properly trained professional historian who knew how to dig out these things, who knew how to document historical things, who knew how to construct historical arguments and so on. You know, there were important alliances built between historians and Māori groups, and Harry Everson, for example, who wrote that chapter, he was one. He was a historian, and he did a lot of work with Ngāi Tahu, documenting their stuff and assisting their claim. There was a lot of academics and universities working with Māori groups at this time, trying to get these claims together. So all over the country, there was evidence of vast amounts of land, just even in the land, but all sorts of other things too, vast amounts of land taken in all manner of unfair ways. I mean, there was the stuff sort of back in the 19th century talked about the raupatu, the confiscations. There was a whole heap of stuff during the war where, you know, oh, we just need to use this bit for the war effort, and then never quite got around to giving it back, and then, oh, you borrowed that stuff for the war, well, can we have it back? Oh, no. And there was lands board stuff, and there was roading things. There was all sorts of stuff. Basically, the Crown just helped themselves to things, and Māori, mostly Crown, but some private things too, were you know, kind of powerless to stop them. So all of these things started to come out. You know, there was some of it was confiscated, some of it was taken in lieu of rates owing, because I said, you know, the rural areas that people had left became even more impoverished, and then there were rates demands, and then it was like, well, how do you meet the rates demands of the council and that alienated land as well. So some of it for schools as well, for education and so on. All these sorts of things, all this loss of land. So when these judgments started coming through from the Waitangi Tribunal, people were really genuinely shocked at what they had documented, because, you know, most people, unless they'd actually kind of engaged in groups where they'd been confronted with this, or they'd studied it, still sort of believed the stuff that everybody was brought up on, that there was nothing really that bad done in terms of colonisation in this country. But what they found was that the extent of this dispossession that was being documented by the Waitangi Tribunal was far higher than anybody had anticipated. So the Waitangi Tribunal, and that sort of that broader brief for the Waitangi Tribunal was a major change in terms of pushing this thing along. One of the things it also did was that it kind of undermined the radical action, because, as I said, the progress on this and getting these claims on the agenda was achieved by radical action, by people not being concerned about what the law says and just going, we need to do this, and engaging in this. So the radicals had pushed things along and got things moving. But once the Waitangi Tribunal was set up, it was like, well, there's no more room for radical action, because, you know, maybe you did that then because there was nowhere to deal with this, but now, you know, this is the proper channel, and you don't go and occupy things, you go and take your claim to the Waitangi Tribunal. So all of that kind of direct action, like the Bastion Point, Takapara and so on, people couldn't do anymore. This was all suddenly became illegitimate. But at the same time as this was illegitimate, the actual Waitangi tribunal process was really long and really slow. Because they were so big, the tribunal, because they had no idea how the government would set it up, how much was going to be involved in it, it was under-resourced. So things took a long, long time. And in the meantime, just wait, because this is the proper way to do it, and so on. In the meantime, a number of Māori groups, particularly the New Zealand Māori Council, did find some other ways forward, and that was in the form of some legal options. And around about this time, there was some significant legal challenges to what was going on, what the state was doing. And in particular, there was a challenge to Labour's privatisation policy. So I need to just sort of step back a little bit now and just explain to you the broad outline of this. That when Labour got in 1984, one of the things they did, in fact, the most significant in a way thing that they did, is that they had Roger Douglas was the finance minister, and he had a plan of how he was going to reorganise New Zealand's economy, and so they engaged in this radical restructuring of the whole of the New Zealand economy and New Zealand society along lines that are broadly called neoliberal. That's a whole big thing, and if I would say if you're doing 206, the 206 is for the people who are doing the BA, so it isn't really in the Bachelor of Teaching and Learning, but there's a whole section that I do looking at that whole neoliberal restructuring in Education 206. But essentially, what one of the critical elements of it was that agencies of the state, publicly owned government bodies, were being corporatised and then privatised. So, and this policy was being pushed by the government, by the Labour government, starting in 1984, and also by Treasury. Treasury was the department of government that is to do with kind of balancing the books, but they had a very clear financial, economic agenda that they were pushing too. So there were these powerful forces that were pushing, and internationally there were things going on at the same time too. So the big push, as I said, was corporatisation and privatisation. And corporatisation was essentially getting state activities, reorganising state activities so that they run along corporate lines. And universities are an example of that. They used to be kind of autonomous organisations of academics, and then what happened was they sort of corporatised them, so the vice chancellors became a CEO, and there were line management and so on. The health system got corporatised. Other parts of society did too, and often what happened was that this corporatisation, getting things to run like a business, was the first step towards then selling them off, because once they're running like a business, then they can be privatised. So there was the corporatisation step, and then there was the privatisation step. And what happened is that many were sold off. So Air New Zealand is an example, the Bank of New Zealand, the Post Office. Before all this, the Post Office used to be, used to deal with your letters, used to deal with the telephones, used to deal with banking. And what happened was that those three all got chopped up. So New Zealand Post got created, Telecom got created, and Postbank got created. They were three separate corporations. So the Post Office used to be a government department. These things were run as separate corporations, and then Telecom was sold off, as a profitable organisation, and that's how, and it was overseas company bought Telecom and had a monopoly and ripped us off blind for like about 15 years with overcharging and repatriating profits and terrible service. But anyway, the point of it is that all of these activities of the state, mines, forestry, electricity, fisheries, the education system happened to this, to the health system too, were corporatised, and then a number of them were privatised as well. That is actually sold by the state to other people. So what's the point of all this? Well, the point of all this is that, as I said, the government was trying to corporatise and privatise society, and Māori were lodging claims with the Waitangi Tribunal. And this led to a major conflict. And the conflict was that Māori was saying, just a minute, this stuff that you are selling is not actually yours. You know, there are things here that we've got claims over, and particularly in terms of the forestries, the mines, the fisheries, all this kind of stuff that was being privatised at the same time as there were Waitangi Tribunal claims over this stuff. And there was a situation with the Glenfield Steelworks up in the North Island, for example, where there was this Chinese buyer all set to sign on the dotted line, and then the local hapu iwi there said, actually, don't you buy this, we're still going to try and claim it back, and threw a cat among the pigeons, and the whole thing fell over. So what happened was that the act that the government was using to try to make all this thing happen was the State-Owned Enterprise Act. This was the way that the formal mechanism for the government to create corporations, right? And what they wrote in this to try and deal with this complexity is in section 9 of that act. It says, nothing in this act shall permit the Crown to act in a matter that is inconsistent with the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. Right? So this was what was in the act, and this was the government's way of saying to Māori, it's all right, this act makes sure that your interests won't be affected, and we can carry on with our corporatisation and privatisation program. Well, the Māori Council sought and won a Court of Appeal judgment overturning a whole lot of stuff and challenging this. And this is the first time actually that the court wrote down what it understood the principles of the treaty to be. So the court defined the principles of the treaty for the first time and established that where a law makes reference to the treaty, that does actually carry some legal weight. So this was the first point at which treaty obligations got actually written into legislation that had genuine bite, that Māori could go to the court and say, the legislation says this, it's referred to the treaty, written in the legislation, and so this is the grounds on which we're challenging it. And that had never been there before. So Treasury, which was the Department of Government which was pushing all this stuff, was freaking out about all this thing because they wanted to push this corporatisation and privatisation agenda. So they were sort of running around looking for explanations and things, and at the end of the 80s there did this document in response to that act that says the fact that something less than sovereignty was conveyed in the Māori text of the treaty does not mean that the reference to sovereignty in the English text is therefore invalidated. So hanging on to that, the English text of the treaty, questioning the Māori claim to tino rangatiratanga and so on in the Māori version, going on to say government may have reasonable objectives in exercising its treaty-given right to govern that might require modification of an absolute right to tino rangatiratanga. So the guarantees that Māori had in Te Tiriti to tino rangatiratanga, Treasury is saying should be, because the government has this power to govern, it should be able to adjust them a little bit and not just take them at face value. So it was all this sort of shuffling around to try and get out of this kind of bind that the government was in. At the same time as this, there was another claim, which was a Waitangi Tribunal claim about te reo Māori, and because the part of the treaty that guarantees full, exclusive, and undisturbed possession of which is Article 2. In the Māori version, it says that Māori will be able to retain same sort of thing, full, exclusive, undisturbed possession, but it lists the things: lands, forests, fisheries, and taonga. And taonga is a term that it essentially translates as treasure. So all those things that are of significant, important value. And so there was a claim taken to the Waitangi Tribunal saying that taonga are protected under the treaty. And what could be more of a taonga to Māori than the language that is the sort of basis of the whole culture and society? So this claim was being made, and it was basically said that taonga, te reo Māori, was being consistently undermined through the courts, through the education system, through the media, through all of these sorts of things. And so the Waitangi Tribunal heard that claim, and as a result of that, there were some initiatives. There was a Māori Language Commission that was established in the wake of this. There was also the Māori Language Act. Well, this 1987 was the first time that te reo Māori was made an official language of New Zealand. I mean, up until then, you had to deal with government in English. Since 1987, anybody has the right to interact with government in te reo Māori, and government just has to respond, has to develop the resources to respond it. So the recognition of the language like that. 89, also in the wake of all of this, the Education Act giving official recognition to kura kaupapa Māori and whare wānanga. So the 80s there was progress being made. There was kind of recognition, official recognition by the state that this stuff had to actually be taken seriously. But at the same time, there was this freaking out by the people in authority, particularly kind of the neoliberals, about what the hell was going on, because everywhere they turned, there was something extra happening. So what that kind of opened the way for then was the 1990s, which was the period of settlements. Okay, so right, the 1990s, the period of settlement. So I just want to rattle through some big headings for this. So first I want to talk about Sea Lords, the beginning of the 90s, then the fiscal envelope, and the Office of Treaty Settlements, and so on. So let me just, that stuff will all be repeated, so don't worry about that. Okay, so the 1990s, the period of settlement. So there was the Waitangi Tribunal on te reo Māori, but what happened is that through the 90s, more and more issues came through, issues relating to fisheries and land claims and all sorts of things. Now, one of these big ones, as I said, was the fisheries. And you guys probably know quite a lot about fisheries, being in Nelson, with how big the fishing industry is here. What happened is that as part of this corporatisation and privatisation thing, the government set up the current system, which is known as this ITQ, the individual transferable quota. Are you familiar with that system? Basically means that all of the fish resource of the country, all the commercial catchable fish source of the country, is divided up into species and into quota. And this was the system that set that up. And so basically what they did is they said, well, who's catching all of the fish now? So they did a big inventory of who's catching what. And then they did an estimate of what sort of catch amounts the fishery could sustain. And then they effectively gave the companies and individuals who were currently fishing, they gave them the right to keep on catching that much of those species of fish. And that right, and then nobody else had any right to anything, but those people could sell those rights, and so they were the individual transferable quotas. So they turned what was just everybody goes out fishing into a sort of a finite control of the resource, which in a resource management idea is a good idea, but they also effectively then kind of corporatised and privatised in one go the whole of the fisheries. And part of this deal in 1989 saw the transfer of 10% of this overall fishing quota to Māori to be allocated by the Waitangi Fisheries Commission. And this was to ensure that Māori had some involvement in the fishery as well. Well, they might have been able to do that 20 years earlier, but they weren't able to do that in 1989 because Māori challenged that allocation of the fishery resource under the terms of the treaty. And this was a biggie because they took it to the Waitangi Tribunal, and the Waitangi Tribunal agreed with their claim against the individual transferable quota plan. And this is what the Waitangi Tribunal said, that they said that quota plan was in fundamental conflict with the treaty's principles and terms, apportioning to non-Māori the full exclusive, apportioning to non-Māori the full exclusive and undisturbed possession of the property and fishing that to Māori was guaranteed. So they've actually given the entire fishery away to non-Māori when the treaty says that Māori have the right to all of it. I mean, even the English version of the treaty is crystal clear. Full, exclusive, undisturbed possession of the fisheries, you know. That's what was written there in black and white in the English version, not the Māori version. And they went on to say that that a literal interpretation of the treaty could create an awkward result today. Essentially saying that, you know, that if we look at the terms of the treaty literally, non-Māori get none of this fishery at all. So all of those big companies that are running the fishery are going to lose the lot. So this was the first of one of these kind of brokering of deals. And the 1992 deal that was called the Sea Lords deal, in response to this, basically gave the biggest fishing company in the country, Sea Lords, gave 50% of that to Māori, plus 20% of all new species that were going to happen in the future, and 18 million in cash, a total of $170 million. And this was the first of the big kind of settlements. And I mean, as you can see, this is a slice. This is a reasonable slice, but this is a slice of the fishery. This is not all the fishery that was guaranteed. And this is the first example of one of these settlements where Māori claimants basically settled for less than they could have kind of insisted on, for the purposes of kind of getting on and moving ahead. But other people saw that as being this massive handout to Māori who basically did nothing and just get handed this whole big massive resource of fish. So as I said, that was the first big settlement, and all of you know the powers that be in Wellington are going, well, where is this going to end? Where's this thing going to end? What will they be claiming next? And Treasury and government wanted to kind of get some certainty and you know, to know how they could kind of deal with this. So in 1994 they came up with this thing that became known as the fiscal envelope. And the fiscal envelope was basically a sum which they put out $1 billion, and basically what they said is that this is all the country could afford. This was the total amount. So all of the claims that had gone through the Waitangi Tribunal up to that point, including Sea Lords and all the rest of it, would all have to be taken out of this finite sum of money, that sum of money being $1 billion. So, this is 1994. This is about 10 years after Labour had come in, after the Waitangi Tribunal powers had been backdated. And so you can not be surprised that Māori were pretty furious about this, because for 10 years they had been told, okay, so here is the proper procedure to go through, don't need to take radical action, now we're listening, now we're actually going to address all of this stuff. Before the treaty, all Māori could take radical action outside the law before the Waitangi Tribunal. One of the effects of the Waitangi Tribunal meant that you couldn't take radical action. You had to go through the right procedures and so on. And there was no more radical action because this is the way to go. And then suddenly they discover that the goalposts have been shifted, the rules have been changed, and actually there's not going to be settlements for the full amount of the dispossession that Māori suffered. What happened here is that there was this kind of game of hardball between the iwi claimants and the Crown. And the Crown's response was to set up this thing called the Office of Treaty Settlement. So it was sort of bypassing the Waitangi Tribunal, and in 1995 it set up this Office of Treaty Settlements where the government was going to engage in direct negotiations with the claimants at a big iwi level rather than the kind of the smaller claimant level. So it's trying to group all these things through into bigger claims. And a lot of the Waitangi Tribunal stuff had come through, and that was kind of informing it. But essentially, the government was sort of was pushing hard on these things, and they were offering the Māori claimants far less than the Waitangi Tribunal had ruled that was the value of their dispossession. And so the claimants ended up in a situation where, do they hold out for more, or do they kind of, take what they can get? And all the big thing was, let's move forward, let's get out of grievance mode, let's kind of do what we can, and so on. So there was a lot of pressure on them to settle, and there were really fraught, tense debates within claimant groups about how to respond to these government positions. After Sea Lords, there were a couple of other big settlements in the 1990s. There was 95, the Waikato Tainui Raputu, which was settled at 170 million, and then 2 years later there was the Ngāi Tahu settlement, also at 170 million, and then the government effectively kind of used those formula to try and leverage off against some of the other claimants to sort of pressure them into settling as well. Just to give an idea of because $1 billion sounds like it's quite a lot of money, but in terms of government expenditure, this is one piece. How much is $1 billion? Funding for counties Manukau DHB, right? So this is the area sort of south of Auckland, not Auckland, counties Manukau DHB. In 2008, 2009, just for that 1 year was $1.07 billion. So $1 billion sounds like a lot when you're working for $16 an hour, but when you're looking at the amount of money the government deals with, it's actually not much at all. And these claims were worth way more than that, but people just felt they had to kind of take what they could, and as a gesture to the country to kind of get things going, and so they compromised quite radically on this. In fact, the settlements were reached at around about 3% of the value of what the Waitangi Tribunal said that the losses were worth. And a big survey of all the claimants found that they saw their settlements as compromise deals which did not fully compensate their people for their loss, but were the best they could secure under the current settlement policy. So there was a sense amongst the Maori claimants that, you know, they had been led to believe there would be proper sort of full and final settlements of these things. Then they got kind of nailed down with this fiscal envelope, but they sort of took what they could in a compromise deal to try and kind of move things forward. Little did they know that this whole settlement process was going to be followed by the noughties, the first decade of the 2000s, and generate a massive backlash. Because by the 2000s, as I said, a number of these settlements had already been in place, that Maori claimants had been kind of cornered into backing down and compromising. And in this context, Labour, who were sort of trying to take this thing seriously, they had been out of office. They got ousted in 1990, they lost the election in 1990, and 93 and 96. And in 99 they came back in. Helen Clark won the election in 99, and a big part of their election campaign was closing the gaps. And closing the gaps was a policy that was primarily aimed at looking at the disadvantage that Māori were suffering and pledging to address that disadvantage, those inequalities, and all the different institutions and kind of statistical measures where they appeared. But at the same time, all the public could see was not Māori disadvantage. All they could see was massive handouts. And so there was this formula for this massive backlash. And what happened was that when Labour won the election in 1999, they could sense this, and they started getting worried about it. And that closing the gaps policy that was a major part of their election campaign just sank. Like, it was, once they were in government, it was never mentioned. They just dropped it like, not like a hot potato, is it? Well, they dropped it like something you don't want to have in your hand. They didn't want to be seen with, right? And then what happened is there was another big development in this, which shouldn't have actually been a development, but kind of became one. And this was again a legal case, and it was a case between the Attorney General and Ngāti Apa. Ngāti Apa was a Māori group from the top of the South Island, and they had a case that they were taking over access to kaimoana, I think it was to like mussel beds and so on in the Marlborough Sounds area. And the principle that they were going on is one that I mentioned earlier. It's this thing called the Doctrine of Aboriginal Title. And essentially what they were saying is that they should be able to mount a case for customary property rights in areas where title has not been transferred to the Crown. And this is a long-standing kind of legal principle that says that even where sovereignty has been transferred, the actual land only is transferred where it's actually been transferred. And so what they were saying is that the seabed and foreshore has never been in actual title. So there's never any identifiable point where customary ownership of the seabed and foreshore has been transferred to the Crown. And where there hasn't been a transfer, claims can be based on, according to sort of international doctrine of Aboriginal title customary law, claims can be based on continuous use. And so the test for this is if an Indigenous population can establish that they have had continuous use for customary purposes of this area over this period of time, then they can claim title to it. So that's uninterrupted. It's not from time to time. It's continuous. It's quite a high threshold to meet. And the judgment in this case was that was that the court found that Māori were able to take claims on this principle to be heard in the Māori Land Court. So it wasn't actually a substantive judgment at all, it was a procedural judgment. But up until then, the court had said, through previous cases that you don't need to know the details of, the court had said there is no room to move on this. In this case, the court said, yes, we are not going to stop you from taking this claim to the Māori Land Court. Well, all that actually did was it meant that the legal obstacle that had been unfairly in place had been removed. There's still a high threshold required to substantiate a claim, and there was no claim that was ever even brought, because what happened was that there was this massive outcry as a result of it, and this case was interpreted as being just absolutely a step too far, because there was this perception that even after all these massive amounts of money paid to Māori for the settlements and so on, here they are back for more, and that what this judgment means is that Māori are going to have exclusive ownership of the whole coastline, and everybody else who isn't Māori isn't going to be able to have access to the beach unless they decide to give it to us. So there's no room for non-Māori New Zealanders, and so this judgment happened, and actually nothing like that happened. Absolutely nothing like that happened. This Labour just freaked out completely. Labour were in government at the time, and they totally freaked out because of this backlash. They'd already dropped closing the gaps, and so they ran around to try and quickly get legislation in called the Seabed and Foreshore Act to reverse that decision of the court, to overturn the decision of the court, because Parliament can change any decision. The court can change the law to close this loophole, to try and address this sort of thing. And that was that move that basically alienated the Māori MPs within Labour and led to the creation of the Māori Party, and there was this massive hikoi and whatever. So there was this huge turmoil. Labour was freaking out, and then right at this time, and this all happened in 2003, in January 2004, Don Brash, who was the leader of the National Party, saw the opportunity, and so he gave this speech to the Orewa Rotary Club in January 2004. It's every national leader since in the 1950s or whatever they start the year by doing that State of the Nation speech to the Orewa Rotary Club, and in this one, Don Brash targeted this particular issue. He started to talk about the treaty industry, that there are all these people that were just, snouts in the trough, getting all of this hard-earned public money for themselves, elites and so on. He talked about race-based policies. He's saying, we're getting to the situation where there's different laws for different people. There needs to be one law for everyone. We're not Māori and Pākehā, we're all one people. Māori are dividing the country and weakening us and undermining us and setting people against each other. Māori are in positions of privilege where they're making all these unfair claims and getting all this handout, getting more than their fair share, that whole thing. And he just totally kind of went to town on it. There's a couple of quotes from him. The dangerous drift towards racial separatism in New Zealand and the development of the now entrenched treaty grievance industry. We are one country with many peoples, not simply a society of Pākehā and Māori where the minority has a birthright to the upper hand, as the Labour government seems to believe. We should not use the treaty as a basis for creating civil, political or democratic rights for Māori, greater civil, political or democratic rights for Māori than any other New Zealander. In the 21st century, it is unconscionable for us to be taking that separatist path, and this Labour government deserves to be defeated on that basis alone. So he saw his opportunity, and he basically played the race card. And what happened? What happened was that his personal popularity jumped 17 percentage points overnight. The highest jump that has ever been in the history of political polling in New Zealand. And National was onto a winner. And not only did they feel that they were on a winner with this kind of thing, kind of appealing to that idea that lots of people had because they didn't know the history of it and they didn't know what was going on, that Māori were kind of getting more than their fair share and when was it going to end and all this kind of stuff and dividing it. So they were onto a winner, and they were also freaking out Labour because Labour knew that basically the population of New Zealand hadn't kept up with what was going on and just saw the stuff that they saw in the media and were freaking out. They thought the Māori were going to come and take their section off them and stop them going to the beach and all this kind of stuff. And so Labour freaked out too, and so they ran a mile from it as well. So this speech was kind of a turning point in kind of politics in New Zealand on this issue, that people who had been working on it and sort of thought that there was some kind of understanding about what was going on with the settlements, actually discovered that there was this massive backlash against them. And so there's this great big kind of messy thing that has been kind of around ever since and caused all sorts of other difficulties, which is what I'm going to be focusing on in the last lecture on Wednesday. So that's it for now. But do you want to talk some? I've taken your lunchtime, haven't I? Sorry about that. You got any questions about the essay while I'm here? You all got that under control?
Yeah. You did a really good job of explaining it, by the way. We felt that you went over it really well and there's no confusion.
Yeah.
Oh, good. So you're not confused anymore?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Well, we weren't.
Okay.
You did a good job in all the lectures explaining it.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. So you don't need anything else? Great.
The
Yeah?
other thing that may I suggest to a lot of people that have been asking you those questions is that Frida's lecture was excellent and explained an awful lot and her slides too.
Of the technical bits.
Right, of what an actual university essay is. Yeah.
And even breaking down the quote and suggesting discussion points for
Right.
the essay.
Right. Oh, that's good. Good. Anything else? No?
Thank you, Tony.
Okay. Oh, thanks for having me. It's nice